The year splits open like a wound. Ships slide through black water, their holds alive with something no eye can name. Rats scurry, fleas bite. A single cough becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. Markets fall silent overnight. Bells toll until the metal cracks. Whole cities vanish as if swallowed by the earth. What if it wasn't fate at all? What if it was trade itself? The veins of Europe, pumping death with every coin exchanged. Florence gasps first, then Paris, then London. Roads once thick with merchants turn into corridors of rot. Priests bless the dying and collapse in the same breath. Kings issue decrees no one lives to read. The map of Europe twists under invisible claws. Borders dissolve. Thrones tremble. Laborers name their own price while nobles dig their own graves. The old order burns without flame. Imagine what would happen if an empire's heart simply stopped. It did. A plague so ruthless it rewrote every law, every bargain, every certainty. It came from the east like a shadow without end, and in 4 short years it carved a new world out of the bones of the old. In the early 14th century, trade stitched continents together with relentless precision. From the Chinese interior to the Mediterranean, caravans of silk, spices, and furs threaded their way across deserts and mountain passes, carrying wealth and information at a pace that outstripped anything the previous millennium had seen. Along these same routes, an invisible traveler began to move, a microbe later known as Yersinia pestis, a bacterium native to rodent populations on the Central Asian steppe. Its presence was not sudden. It had lingered for centuries in the burrows of marmots and gerbils across the Mongolian grasslands. But by the 1330s, climatic shifts of the so-called Little Ice Age, cooler temperatures and erratic rains, drove rodents toward human settlements and set the stage for transmission on a continental scale. The Mongol Empire, fractured but still commanding immense networks of exchange, became the first bridge. Merchant convoys and military columns traversed the same roads, from the oases of Samarkand and Bokhara to the Black Sea. Fleas feeding on infected rodents leapt to pack animals and their human attendants, their bodies ideal vessels for a pathogen whose virulence defied comprehension. Caravanserais, those fortified in space a day's ride apart, provided warmth and food not only for merchants, but for the rats that followed them. Each pause was an opportunity for infection to shift hosts. By the early 1340s, outbreaks appeared in trade hubs around Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological and textual evidence from burial stones and contemporaneous chronicles describe sudden mortality among local communities, an ominous sign that the bacterium had already entered human populations. From there, the infection traveled westward with caravans bound for the Crimea, converging on the port city of Kaffa, a Genoese colony on the Crimean coast. Kaffa was a prize of strategic value, controlling grain exports and Black Sea commerce. In 1346, it became the focus of a Mongol siege led by the Golden Horde under Khan Janibeg. For months the city resisted bombardment, its walls bristling with defenders, while disease tore through the besieging army. Contemporary accounts, including the notary Gabriel de Mussy, record a chilling episode. As Mongol soldiers succumbed to the sickness, their leaders catapulted the corpses over the walls in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate. Whether this act truly introduced the plague inside or merely hastened an inevitable contagion, the effect was catastrophic. Kaffa's garrison and civilians began to die in terrifying numbers. By the autumn of 1346, merchant vessels crowded the harbor, eager to escape both enemy and epidemic. These ships, crewed by sailors unaware of the fleas hidden in their grain stores and the rats nesting in their bilges, became the unintentional carriers of a pandemic. Genoese traders bound for their home ports weighed anchor and spread out across the Mediterranean. The voyage itself ensured that rats and their parasites multiplied unchecked in the dark holds, feeding on supplies meant for the crew. Each harbor they reached became a new ignition point. In early October 1347, 12 galleys from Kaffa arrived at Messina in Sicily. Within days, dockworkers and townspeople fell ill with sudden fevers, painful swelling of lymph nodes, and blackened skin lesions. the unmistakable signs of bubonic plague. Panic overtook the city as mortality climbed with bewildering speed. Attempts to quarantine the arrivals failed. Some ships were turned away, but not before sailors disembarked and infections took root. From Messina, the contagion traveled swiftly to Catania and Palermo, then across the narrow waters to mainland Italy. Marseille reported its first cases by the end of that same month. The city, a critical link in the Western Mediterranean trade network, saw merchant convoys carry the disease along the Rhone Valley into the heart of France. Venice, a maritime power dependent on constant movement of goods, confronted outbreaks by the spring of 1348 despite efforts to control ship traffic. The speed of transmission astonished contemporaries, a pathogen that could move hundreds of miles in weeks, riding the very currents of commerce that had enriched Europe for centuries. The plague's advance was not a simple matter of ship to shore. Overland routes spread it further. Grain convoys and market wagons from infected ports carried rats inland. The Pur River Valley, dense with settlements and commerce, became a corridor of infection. By January 1348, Florence faced its first deaths, chronicled in stark detail by observers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who would later frame the catastrophe in his Decameron. Underlying this rapid spread was a continent already vulnerable. The Little Ice Age had shortened growing seasons, leading to recurrent famines since the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Urban centers, crowded and unsanitary, offered ideal conditions for flea-borne transmission. Trade, once Europe's great lifeline, now functioned as a circulatory system for disease. The Mediterranean, far from a protective barrier, became the main highway of infection. Galleys departing from Messina and Marseille sailed to Barcelona, Valencia, and the ports of North Africa. Each docking extended the plague's reach. By February 1348, reports of sudden mass deaths emerged from Majorca and across the Iberian coast. Merchant networks that had tied together the Islamic and Christian worlds ensured that no port remained untouched. The bacterium's path from the Central Asian steppe to the shores of the Mediterranean was neither accidental nor mysterious once the mechanisms are traced. Every stage followed the logic of commerce. Rodents disturbed by climate stress, caravans carrying fleas, besieged cities serving as incubators, and merchant ships dispersing infection along established trade routes. The very success of Eurasian exchange became the instrument of devastation. Europe in the mid-14th century was a continent connected as never before. Silver from the Balkans funded imports from the East. Italian republics depended on Black Sea grain. Spices and silks fueled appetites in Paris and London. The plague entered this network not as an external invader, but as a hidden passenger, advancing precisely because Europe had grown so interdependent. Every contract signed, every bale of cloth loaded, every oar stroke toward an open harbor tightened the unseen grip of a microbe that required no permission to travel. As 1347 turned to 1348, the stage was set for a mortality event unmatched in recorded European history. The trade routes that had once promised prosperity now carried a silent contagion that would, within a single year, redraw the demographic and economic map of the continent. From the wind-swept Mongol steppes to the crowded quays of Marseille, the Black Death had arrived, and the rhythm of Europe's life had already begun to break. By the opening months of 1348, the plague had already crossed the Mediterranean like a silent fleet. Sicily's harbors lay stricken, and the contagion moved north with a velocity that stunned chroniclers. Merchant galleys from Messina carried their cargo to the Ligurian coast, bringing rats and fleas into Genoa and Venice, the twin arteries of Italy's maritime economy. Records from January show sudden mortality among dock workers, sailors, and the families who lived in the narrow alleys behind the quays. Attempts at cordon and quarantine were improvised and weak, for no one understood the bacterium or its carriers. Ships were the lifeblood of these cities. Stopping them meant halting grain imports and crippling the economy. Authorities hesitated and the disease advanced. Florence, a city of roughly 100,000, confronted its first deaths in early spring. Contemporary witness Matteo Villani described families collapsing within days, sometimes hours, of the first symptoms. Buboes, painful swellings of the lymph nodes, appeared in the groin or armpit, followed by fever, vomiting, and blackened skin from subcutaneous hemorrhage. Mortality estimates range from 50 to 60% of the population within the year. The scale of loss emptied workshops and left half-built cathedrals silent. Textile production, the engine of Florentine wealth, faltered as workers died or fled. Venice, with its labyrinth of canals and bustling shipyards, suffered equally. The city's Great Council debated restrictions on maritime traffic, but its dependence on trade made drastic measures perilous. Ships arriving from the eastern Mediterranean were sometimes held on the island of Lazaretto Vecchio for observation, an early attempt at quarantine. Yet the policy came too late. By summer 1348, thousands were dead, and burial grounds overflowed. Chroniclers record bodies ferried across the lagoon at night, stacked in hastily dug pits. The very water that once defined Venice's power now carried the infected from parish to parish. Farther west, the papal seat of Avignon in Provence became another epicenter. Pope Clement VI, aware of the mortal danger, enclosed himself in the Palais des Papes and reportedly spent hours between roaring fires to purify the air. His physicians ordered massive processions of penitents, acts that ironically increased contact among the faithful. The Rhone River, a vital commercial artery, transmitted not only goods but contagion to Lyon and beyond. Trade fairs that once drew merchants from across Europe dwindled as travelers feared every caravan. Pilgrimage routes intensified the crisis. Southern Europe was threaded with roads leading to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and countless regional shrines. Devout travelers seeking divine protection carried the plague into rural provinces and small towns that otherwise might have remained isolated. Religious fervor mixed with terror as people sought absolution through movement, unknowingly trailing infected fleas in their clothing and baggage. Each shrine became a node of infection, each returning pilgrim a vector. Economic shock followed in the wake of mortality. Genoa and Venice, dependent on the constant circulation of ships for spices, grain, and textiles, faced abrupt disruption. Dockyards fell silent as sailors perished. Insurance contracts collapsed under the weight of unpaid claims for lost cargoes. In Florence, merchants of the powerful Bardi and Peruzzi families recorded unpaid debts as trading partners across Europe died or ceased operations. Wages for surviving laborers rose sharply, unsettling the rigid hierarchies of late medieval society. The Iberian Peninsula was not spared. Merchant vessels carried the disease from Marseille and Italian ports to Valencia by early spring 1348. From there it advanced to Barcelona and inland to Aragon and Castile. Chronicles describe entire households dead within days, forcing neighbors to abandon villages. Seville recorded its first major outbreak by the summer, and Portuguese ports such as Lisbon soon followed. Grain shipments from North Africa ceased as crews succumbed, tightening the spiral of scarcity. The loss of sailors crippled the Atlantic trade and disrupted the flow of silver from Castile and Portugal that funded European markets. Urban density magnified every factor. Cities such as Florence and Barcelona were enclosed by walls that limited expansion, forcing residents into cramped quarters where refuse piled in streets and wells drew water near cesspits. Fleas found abundant hosts. Sanitation ordinances existed, but were rarely enforced during panic. Authorities attempted to regulate burials and control movement, but fear and ignorance outpaced any policy. Records of municipal meetings show frantic debates over closing gates, banning assemblies, and ordering daily street cleaning, yet the death toll rendered these efforts almost ceremonial. Religious interpretations shaped public response. Many viewed the plague as divine punishment. Flagellant groups appeared in towns across Provence and northern Italy, parading barefoot and whipping themselves in acts of collective penance. Their gatherings, intended as spiritual protection, inadvertently spread infection further. Clergy struggled to meet the demand for last rites, and monasteries lost entire communities. Pope Clement VI issued a bull condemning the persecution of Jews, who were scapegoated in some regions, yet violence erupted in parts of southern France and Aragon, driving survivors eastward. Economic records from this period preserve the stark numbers behind the catastrophe. In Florence, tax registers show a dramatic fall in households assessed for the catasto, the property tax. Venetian ship manifests indicate a steep decline in voyages to the Levant. Grain prices fluctuated wildly as supply chains failed. Landlords faced tenant shortages, and in rural Tuscany, entire estates were abandoned, leading to reforestation of previously cultivated fields. Similar patterns appeared in Catalonia and Valencia, where labor scarcity shifted bargaining power toward surviving peasants. The contagion's timing amplified its devastation. The Little Ice Age had already shortened growing seasons and increased the frequency of crop failures, leaving many malnourished and vulnerable. Maritime trade that once promised stability now became a conduit of lethal exchange. Ships were both lifeline and vector, every port a new starting point for the disease. Attempts at maritime quarantines, such as Venice's 40-day isolation of arriving vessels, a practice that later gave the word quarantine its name, were embryonic and inconsistently enforced during the initial onslaught. By the close of 1348, southern Europe lay transformed. From the Arno to the Tagus, the plague's first great waves scoured cities, harbors, and inland markets with a relentlessness that no army could match. Trade convoys stood idle, altars were unattended, and fields lay unplowed as the infection advanced inexorably north and west, leaving a trail of silence where once the commerce of the Mediterranean had thrived. By the early months of 1348, the plague pressed north through the river arteries of Europe, drawn by the same trade routes that had once brought prosperity. From the Rhone Valley, where Avignon's markets had already thinned, merchants and refugees carried the infection toward Lyon and beyond. Bales of cloth, barrels of grain, and caravans of salt crossed bridges and ferries, each movement carrying fleas hidden in sacks and clothing. The Rhone's commercial lifeline, stretching from the Mediterranean to Burgundy, became a silent corridor of contagion. By mid-year, the disease reached the Champagne region, once the economic center of northern France. The great fairs of Champagne, vital to the cloth trade and banking networks, faltered as merchants from Flanders, Italy, and the Rhineland stayed away or succumbed en route. Contracts were broken overnight. Chroniclers in Troyes and Provence recorded entire streets emptied of their occupants within days, stalls abandoned mid-transaction. The fairs that had for centuries knit together the economies of France, England, and the Low Countries stood deserted, an early signal that Europe's commercial heart was beginning to shift west toward the Atlantic. Paris felt the full force soon after. By the summer of 1348, reports of sudden deaths surged through the capital, a city of perhaps 200,000 tightly packed inhabitants. The University of Paris, Europe's premier center of learning, watched its scholars die in their quarters or flee to the countryside. Masters who remained attempted to analyze the catastrophe, debating whether corrupted air or planetary alignment explained the invisible killer. The medical faculty issued a formal report in October 1348 attributing the outbreak to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, a theory reflecting both the intellectual rigor and the limits of medieval science. Lecture halls fell silent as students perished or scattered. Monastic libraries closed their doors, and the Seine became a highway not only for commerce, but for funeral barges bearing the dead to mass graves on the city's outskirts. The plague advanced along the trade-rich Rhine corridor, the most heavily trafficked waterway of northern Europe. By late 1348, it reached Strasbourg, a city of powerful guilds and busy quays. Local records described frantic efforts to isolate the sick, yet barges continued to arrive from Basel and Cologne, bringing goods and infection in equal measure. Urban density and constant movement rendered containment impossible. Mortality estimates for Strasbourg climb toward half the population within months. From the Rhine, the disease fanned out into the patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire. Nuremberg, Frankfurt, Mainz, and countless market towns reported sudden collapses in population throughout 1349. Town councils recorded the loss of magistrates and guild leaders in the same weeks they debated burial regulations. Many cities saw violent outbreaks of anti-Jewish pogroms, fueled by fear and false rumors of well poisoning. Despite papal edicts condemning such violence, entire Jewish communities were massacred or driven eastward, altering the demographic and economic landscape of the German states for generations. Trade routes through the Low Countries provided no refuge. Bruges and Ghent, the beating heart of Europe's cloth industry, suffered severe outbreaks by early 1349. Flea-infested wool shipments arriving from England and northern France spread the disease among workers crowded in dyeing sheds and weaving halls. Antwerp's port activity slowed to a fraction of its former volume as sailors died aboard ships anchored in the Scheldt River. Municipal accounts from Flanders record sharp declines in customs revenue, proof of commerce unraveling under the weight of fear and mortality. The plague's progress through these regions exposed the vulnerabilities of Europe's economic system. River traffic on the Rhone and Rhine had been the backbone of trade linking the Mediterranean with the North Sea. As mortality mounted, bargemen refused to sail, and markets that depended on steady flows of wine, grain, and textiles faced crippling shortages. The decline of the Champagne fairs and the instability of inland trade encouraged merchants to consider Atlantic alternatives, foreshadowing the gradual shift toward ports such as Antwerp and Bruges that would dominate later centuries. Urban records capture the scale of demographic collapse with stark precision. Tax registers from Paris show tens of thousands of households struck off within a single year. Parish death rolls in Cologne and Mainz double or triple compared with previous decades. In Strasbourg, notarial documents from 1349 are interrupted by long gaps, testimony to the death of clerks themselves. Across the university towns of northern France and the Rhineland, Orleans, Heidelberg, Erfurt, lecture schedules disintegrated as professors and students alike fell ill. The intellectual shock was profound. Europe's most esteemed centers of learning were forced to confront a calamity that defied established theories of medicine and natural philosophy. The University of Paris's astrological explanation, though widely circulated, satisfied few. Physicians attempted bloodletting and fumigation with herbs. None slowed the spread. Monastic chroniclers wrote of a punishment from God, but recorded their observations with clinical care. The speed of infection, the blackened buboes, the near certainty of death within days. These accounts, preserved in Latin and vernacular languages, remain critical evidence of the period's desperate search for understanding. Economic disruption compounded social strain. Skilled artisans vanished, leaving guilds without masters. Grain prices fluctuated wildly as transport faltered along the Rhone and Rhine. Surviving workers commanded higher wages, a reality that unsettled traditional hierarchies and foreshadowed labor conflicts in the decades ahead. Landlords faced shortages of tenants, while city governments struggled to maintain order with depleted tax revenues. By 1349, the plague's relentless march through France, the German states, and the Low Countries had erased familiar patterns of commerce and scholarship. From Paris to Bruges, from Strasbourg to Cologne, the very rivers that had bound Europe together as commercial highways now served as conduits of devastation, carrying rats, fleas, and the bacterium Yersinia pestis farther north and west with each passing week. In June 1348, a merchant vessel from Gascony anchored at Melcombe Regis on the Dorset coast, unloading cargo and an unseen adversary. Rats and their fleas, carriers of Yersinia pestis, slipped ashore with the tide. Within days, people in the bustling port fell ill, fever, swollen lymph nodes, blackened extremities, symptoms that left no doubt to later chroniclers. From this first English foothold, the plague moved with alarming speed through the south of England, tracing the arteries of trade and pilgrimage. By August, it had reached Bristol, a critical link in commerce with Ireland and Wales, and by September the sickness traveled the Thames to London, where a population of perhaps 80,000 faced mortality rates that in some parishes exceeded half. Records from the London City Council in late 1348 show frantic attempts to secure burial grounds as churchyards overflowed. Monks of the Charterhouse established new cemeteries at Smithfield to accommodate the dead. Priests died faster than they could perform last rites, forcing laypeople to bury neighbors in hastily dug pits. Parliamentary sessions were suspended as nobles and officials fled the capital. Trade faltered. Shipments of wool, England's economic mainstay, slowed dramatically as merchants and shepherds alike succumbed. From London, the plague radiated outward along established routes. By early 1349, it reached Oxford and Cambridge, where university life collapsed. Colleges dismissed students, and lectures ceased as scholars perished or sought safety in rural estates. Chroniclers note the silence of the cloisters, libraries abandoned as mortality thinned even the ranks of those trained to record events. Towns along the Severn and Trent rivers reported sudden spikes in deaths, each market town a new node of infection. Wales experienced the scourge soon after. Coastal ports like Carmarthen and the trading hub of Carnarvon reported outbreaks by the spring of 1349, likely carried from Bristol by sea and overland merchants. Welsh annals recount entire communities left without leadership as local lords and clergy died, leaving fields untended and livestock roaming without care. The rugged interior provided little protection. Family ties and small-scale trade ensured the disease found even remote valleys. Scotland faced its first confirmed cases by autumn 1349, though contemporary sources hint at earlier incursions from the north of England. Chroniclers describe sudden mortality in burghs such as Edinburgh and Perth. In some accounts, an army gathering for a raid into England dispersed when plague erupted among its ranks, demonstrating how military movements aided the contagion. Gaelic-speaking regions, though sparsely populated, could not remain isolated indefinitely. Seasonal migrations of herders and fishermen carried infection to distant glens and islands. Across the Irish Sea, the disease reached Dublin by the late summer of 1348 through direct trade with Bristol. Port records show ships arriving with depleted crews, and local annals speak of rapid devastation in the walled city and its hinterlands. Irish monasteries recorded mortality, so severe that some scriptoria ceased work for years. The rural population suffered heavily as English-controlled ports transmitted the pathogen to native settlements, undermining fragile political structures. Agriculture across the British Isles reeled under the shock. In England, where population pressure had already strained farmland, the sudden loss of labor was unprecedented. Manorial court rolls from 1350 reveal deserted villages, places like Warham Percy in Yorkshire, where survivors abandoned marginal fields rather than attempt cultivation without sufficient hands. Grain harvest fell, and wages for ploughmen and reapers surged as landlords competed for scarce workers. Parliament responded with the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, an attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement proved impossible. These measures marked an early shift in the feudal economy, sowing the seeds of serfdom's eventual decline as peasants realized their bargaining power. The plague's maritime reach extended beyond the British Isles to Scandinavia. In 1349, a ship from England carried infected rats to the Norwegian port of Bergen, a vital node of the Hanseatic League's trade in fish and timber. Local annals describe the swift spread through the town and along the coast. From Bergen, trading vessels transmitted the disease to Trondheim and Oslo within months. Norway's rugged geography offered little defense. Fjord settlements reliant on sea trade were vulnerable despite their isolation. Some communities attempted self-imposed quarantine, but supplies and communication depended on coastal traffic, ensuring eventual exposure. Denmark faced similar calamity. By 1350, the plague reached Copenhagen and the islands of Zealand and Funen. Royal records mention the death of Bishop Olaf of Roskeldeu and the paralysis of markets that once linked Denmark to the wider Baltic trade. Grain exports to northern Germany ceased, and fishing fleets shrank as sailors perished. Swedish chronicles, though less detailed, indicate outbreaks in coastal provinces by 1350, likely introduced through contacts with Norwegian and Danish merchants. Throughout these northern kingdoms, demographic collapse mirrored that of southern Europe. Modern estimates suggest that England lost perhaps 40 to 50% of its population between 1348 and 1350. Norway may have lost a similar proportion, a shock that weakened its political structures for generations. Tax registers, manorial rolls, and church records all show abrupt and massive reductions in households. Entire parishes disappeared from diocesan accounts, their lands reverting to forest and pasture. The intellectual centers of Britain and Scandinavia struggled to comprehend the devastation. Chroniclers like Henry Knighton of Leicester and John of Verdun in Scotland documented symptoms with clinical precision: sudden fever, the appearance of buboes, death within 3 days. They speculated on causes ranging from corrupted air to divine judgment, reflecting the limits of 14th century medical knowledge. Physicians offered treatments of bleeding and aromatic fumigation, none of which altered the disease's course. Economic ripples extended beyond immediate mortality. England's wool exports, critical to the textile industries of Flanders, plunged as sheep herds roamed untended and shipping capacity collapsed. Scandinavian timber and fish trades slowed sharply, weakening the Hanseatic networks that had tied the North Sea and Baltic for decades. Surviving laborers demanded higher wages and better conditions, unsettling long-standing social hierarchies. In England, repeated royal edicts attempting to control wages and compel service only underscored the new balance of power between landlord and peasant. The plague's advance through Britain and Scandinavia revealed the full reach of Europe's interconnected trade and communication systems. From the Dorset coast to the fjords of Norway, every harbor and market town became both victim and vector. Merchants seeking profit, priests seeking souls, and peasants seeking work all moved along routes that turned the North Sea and the Atlantic into thoroughfares of infection. By 1350, the disease had cut a wide arc through England, Wales, Scotland, Norway, Denmark, and beyond, leaving landscapes of silence where bustling villages and trading ports had stood only months before. By late 1349, the Black Death pressed against the eastern edge of Europe, its earlier path marked by emptied cities from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. Yet, as the tide of mortality reached Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and the Baltic, its momentum shifted. Merchant routes carried rumors of entire kingdoms undone, but in these lands the pattern fractured. Sparse population densities, dispersed settlements, and calculated restrictions slowed the infection in ways that baffled contemporaries and still command the attention of historians. Poland under King Casimir III confronted the threat with measures rare for the age. Chronicles indicate that as reports from Germany mounted through 1348, authorities tightened river crossings and border stations along the Oder and Vistula. Merchants were required to halt at checkpoints and endure waiting periods before entering major towns. While these actions were not foolproof, they curtailed the immediate influx of potentially infected travelers and their cargo. Coupled with wide stretches of farmland and forest between towns, the plague's advance lost the explosive force seen in the urban belts of France or Italy. Krakow, a keynote of trade and royal administration, recorded deaths, but not the catastrophic collapse of population witnessed in Paris or Florence. Bohemia, ruled by Charles IV, saw more scattered outbreaks, particularly along the Elbe, where German merchants maintained active commerce. Prague experienced cases in 1349, yet municipal records show that mortality never approached the devastation of Western Europe. The kingdom's mixed terrain and fortified towns allowed some control over movement, and the Emperor King's efforts to regulate markets and restrict large gatherings provided limited defense. Still, villages along main trade routes suffered heavily, demonstrating that isolation was relative, not absolute. Hungary's experience followed a similar pattern. Contemporary sources suggest that in 1349 the kingdom experienced pockets of plague, notably in mining towns such as Banska Styavnica and Košice, where German-speaking settlers maintained commercial links to the empire. Yet large swaths of the countryside, particularly in the Great Hungarian Plain, remained less affected. Vast distances between rural communities slowed transmission, and some border lords imposed quarantines on travelers arriving from Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. The absence of densely packed urban centers like those of northern Italy limited the opportunities for fleas to leap from rat to human host in overwhelming numbers. To the north, the Baltic world faced different pressures. The Hanseatic League's network of ports, Danzig, Lübeck, Riga, depended on constant maritime traffic of grain, timber, and furs. The plague entered these channels through ships from Flanders and northern Germany. Danzig, a critical hub on the Vistula estuary, recorded significant mortality in 1349 and 1350 as vessels from Stralsund and Lübeck brought infected rodents. Municipal records from Riga describe the sudden loss of magistrates and guild members, forcing temporary suspension of city governance. Yet even here the disease often remained localized to urban centers and did not always penetrate deep into the rural hinterland. Trade along the Baltic slowed sharply. Grain exports from the Vistula basin fell as bargemen refused to risk contact at crowded docks. Timber shipments to the Low Countries dwindled, disrupting the shipbuilding economies of Holland and Flanders. Hanseatic merchants who survived faced collapsing credit networks as partners perished in western cities. The League's Diet meetings in 1350 were sparsely attended, with reports of missing delegations from cities crippled by plague. While some regions escaped mass mortality, none were free from social upheaval. Across the German-speaking cities of the Holy Roman Empire, Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, accusations against Jewish communities intensified as the plague advanced. Rumors spread that wells were poisoned or that secret plots sought Christian destruction. These charges, unfounded yet potent, ignited violent pogroms throughout 1348 and 1349. Entire neighborhoods were burned, and thousands were killed or expelled. Survivors fled eastward, seeking refuge in the comparatively stable realms of Poland and Lithuania. Royal charters from Casimir III granted protection and settlement rights to these refugees, reshaping the demographic and economic landscape of Eastern Europe. Jewish communities established in Krakow, Lublin, and along the Vistula became integral to the region's commercial life, their presence a direct consequence of West European persecution during the plague years. The contrast between devastated western cities and the more tempered impact east of the Elbe sharpened contemporary awareness of geography's power. Chroniclers noted with astonishment that while France and Italy buried half their people, parts of Poland and Hungary continued their harvests and maintained trade. Theories abounded: divine favor, healthier air, or superior governance. Modern scholarship points instead to a combination of lower population density, fewer large urban centers, and the early adoption of rudimentary quarantines and travel restrictions. Still, the eastern frontier was not untouched. Lithuanian chronicles describe sudden deaths in port towns along the Baltic and sporadic outbreaks in inland markets. Pomeranian villages near Danzig recorded empty fields and abandoned mills. In Bohemia, monastic records from 1350 recount labor shortages and higher wages for surviving peasants, echoing economic patterns across Europe. The absence of a uniform catastrophe did not prevent local crises of agriculture, taxation, and administration. The plague's uneven reach influenced long-term trade patterns. With Rhine and Rhone routes weakened and Champagne fares in decline, merchants increasingly sought alternative connections. The relative stability of Polish grain markets attracted attention from German and Baltic traders, while the safe passage through the Carpathians to the Black Sea remained valuable for commerce with the Mongol-controlled steppe. Hanseatic merchants adjusted their schedules, balancing risk against the need for timber and amber from the Baltic littoral. The migration of Jewish communities eastward had profound consequences. Charters such as the Statute of Kalisz, reaffirmed by Casimir in 1334 and reinforced during the crisis years, offered legal autonomy and protection that Western cities had violently withdrawn. These policies drew skilled artisans, financiers, and traders to Polish towns, enriching economic networks, just as Western Europe's commercial heart reeled from depopulation. The very violence of the German pogroms became a catalyst for cultural and economic transformation along the Vistula and beyond. By the early 1350s, while Western Europe struggled to repopulate emptied countryside, many Polish and Hungarian regions maintained a degree of continuity rare for the era. Ports like Danzig resumed Hanseatic shipping more quickly than their counterparts in the Low Countries, leveraging their geographic advantage and relatively preserved labor force. Bohemia's silver mines returned to production, sustaining the monetary systems that underpinned Central European trade. The Black Death's movement across Europe did not follow a single pattern. In these eastern lands, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and the Baltic states, the interplay of geography, policy, and demography shaped an outcome distinct from the devastation of France, Italy, or England. Sparse populations slowed contagion, border controls blunted its force, and the violence of Western pogroms drove new communities eastward, altering the region's social and economic fabric while the plague continued its relentless sweep through the continent. The Black Death did not only empty streets and villages, it struck at the core of Europe's economy with a precision that shattered centuries of trade patterns. When the plague reached its peak between 1347 and 1353, the Mediterranean, long the beating heart of commerce, began to falter. Merchant galleys that once stitched together the ports of Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona lost sailors faster than shipwrights could replace them. In 1349 Venetian, records show merchant fleets reduced by nearly half, their harbor silent, while contracts for spices and silks lay abandoned. The Arsenal of Venice, once a symbol of maritime might, struggled to outfit even a fraction of its usual convoys as laborers died or fled. Genoa, whose merchants had once commanded the western Mediterranean, suffered similar paralysis. Grain ships from Sicily went uncollected, and the once bustling entrepôts of Corsica and Sardinia fell into scarcity. The plague's timing collided with a Europe already stressed by the Little Ice Age's shorter growing seasons. Grain harvests that might have stabilized prices instead rotted in unmanned fields or spoiled in ports lacking crews to carry them north. Each failed shipment sent markets into turmoil, forcing city councils from Florence to Marseille to impose rationing and price controls that could not hold. Across the continent, trade fairs that had defined medieval exchange staggered. The famed Champagne fairs, which for over a century had funneled Italian cloth and Levantine spices toward Flanders, dwindled to shadows by 1350 as merchants refused to risk the disease-ridden corridors of France. The Rhine and Rhone arteries, long the inland lifelines of commerce, slowed to a crawl. River toll records from Cologne and Strasbourg revealed dramatic drops in barge traffic, some routes losing more than two-thirds of their previous volume in a single year. While Mediterranean supremacy faltered, opportunity flickered on Europe's Atlantic edge. Ports like Lisbon, Seville, and later Antwerp found themselves in a shifting geography of necessity. Lisbon's location at the mouth of the Tagus, once peripheral, gained sudden importance as merchants looked for safer waters and alternative grain supplies. Portuguese chroniclers in the early 1350s note a cautious but unmistakable rise in shipments of salt fish and wine northward, a preview of the maritime dynamism that would later define the Age of Discovery. In the Low Countries, Bruges and the upstart harbor of Antwerp began to attract trade that had once passed through the Mediterranean. Flemish cloth merchants, cut off from the regular flow of Italian dyes and Eastern luxuries, turned to English wool and North Sea fisheries. By the late 1350s, Antwerp's wharves recorded higher tonnage than a decade earlier despite the continent-wide population collapse, signaling a redirection of maritime energy toward the Atlantic. The gradual reorientation was not yet the full-scale transoceanic economy of later centuries, but the Black Death planted the seed by undermining the old axis that linked the Levant to northern Europe through Italian middlemen. Labor scarcity became the pivot on which the social order turned. Across France, England, and the German states, whole villages lay abandoned, fields untilled, workshops locked. Surviving workers understood their sudden leverage. English manorial rolls from 1351 reveal wage demands as much as double pre-plague levels. Landlords, desperate to harvest crops and rebuild revenues, faced rebellion when they tried to enforce the old serfdom obligations. The Statute of Labours issued by Edward III in June 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague rates and bind peasants to their lords, but enforcement collapsed under the sheer reality of scarcity. Grain shortages magnified the shock. With fewer farmers and disrupted trade, prices spiked unevenly. In Florence and Siena, municipal archives record wheat prices rising by more than 50% during the worst years of mortality. Northern Europe saw similar volatility. In some Hanseatic ports, rye doubled in cost within a season. Those who survived possessed greater bargaining power, compelling landlords to commute feudal dues into cash payments or fixed rents. This shift weakened the very foundations of the feudal economy, giving rise to a proto-market system where wage labor and free tenancy spread across England, the Low Countries, and parts of France. Monetary effects rippled outward. Silver mines in Bohemia and the Tyrol lost miners to illness, constraining coinage and raising the value of precious metals. Italian banking families, such as the Bardi and Peruzzi, already strained by earlier defaults from European monarchs, faced ruin as trade collapsed and debtors perished. The contraction of credit forced merchants to seek new partners and safer routes, accelerating the move toward regional markets and fostering smaller, more flexible financial networks. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval life, underwent a brutal recalibration. In England's Norfolk and Suffolk, manorial surveys from the 1350s show thousands of acres reverting to pasture as grain cultivation became unprofitable with scarce labor. Sheep grazing required fewer hands, encouraging a turn toward wool production that fed the textile centers of Flanders and, later, domestic English cloth making. This transformation foreshadowed the commercial agriculture that would dominate late medieval and early modern Europe. The Mediterranean did not vanish, but its uncontested dominance fractured. Venice eventually regained strength, yet its monopoly on eastern luxuries weakened as Atlantic ports and overland alternatives matured. Genoa redirected attention to the western Mediterranean and, decades later, to partnerships with Iberian explorers. The Ottoman rise in the 15th century would compound these shifts. But the initial break came with the plague's devastation of manpower, fleets, and the confidence of long-distance traders. Peasants, artisans, and merchants all felt the tremors. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 erupted from the pressures of high taxation and rising expectations for wages and rights. England would face the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, a direct echo of the economic dislocation set in motion by the Black Death. These uprisings were not mere spasms of violence. They were signals of a society in which labor recognized its newfound worth and refused to remain bound by feudal custom. The reconfiguration of trade and labor markets unfolded over decades, but the break was unmistakable. Atlantic-facing ports from Lisbon to the Scheldt estuary strengthened their ties, setting the stage for the maritime empires of the 15th and 16th centuries. Wage labor supplanted serfdom in much of Western Europe, while grain markets adapted to a leaner, more mobile workforce. The plague had not only killed millions, it had redrawn the map of commerce and shifted economic gravity toward the ocean horizons that would soon carry European ships across the world, forever altering the balance of power and the flow of wealth. The Black Death ripped through Europe with a force that left more than bodies in its wake. It destabilized belief, shook political structures, and carved new paths in art and thought. By the time the first great wave subsided around 1353, the continent was restless, haunted, and primed for upheaval that would echo for decades. Faith, once the surest refuge, fractured under the strain. In the plague years, priests died in staggering numbers, often at rates higher than their parishioners because they administered last rites to the infected. Whole dioceses stood leaderless. In Avignon, where the papacy resided during the crisis, Pope Clement VI ordered fires kept burning in the streets and granted plenary indulgence to all who died of the plague, a desperate gesture that underscored the Church's limits. When prayers and processions failed to halt the mortality, the faithful searched for new explanations, some turning inward toward private piety, others outward in rage. By 1349, the flagellant movement surged across the German states and the Low Countries. Thousands of men, often barefoot and hooded, marched from town to town, whipping themselves with knotted cords tipped in iron until blood ran down their backs. They sang hymns and chanted penitential psalms, believing their suffering could appease divine wrath. Local records from cities such as Cologne and Strasbourg describe the spectacle of entire squares filled with penitents, their cries mingling with the tolling of plague bells. At first, some clergy tolerated the processions, but as the movement grew unruly, spreading anti-clerical messages and claiming direct authority from God, the papacy struck back. Clement VI condemned the flagellants in October 1349, issuing a bull that denounced their rituals as heresy. Suppression followed, yet the memory of these mass public penances lingered as a testament to how the plague shook the hierarchy of the Church. The cultural impact deepened as survivors struggled to articulate a world where death had shown itself in such relentless proximity. Art and literature turned macabre, dwelling on decay and the universality of mortality. Murals of the Danse Macabre began appearing in cemeteries and church walls by the 1420s, depicting skeletons leading men and women of every rank in a grisly dance, a reminder that no wealth or title could buy immunity. Earlier, in 1353, Giovanni Boccaccio completed the Decameron, framing his collection of tales around a group of young Florentines who retreat to the countryside to escape the plague of 1348. His vivid introduction, describing corpses abandoned in Florence's streets and the breakdown of family bonds, remains one of the most precise eyewitness accounts of those months. Writers across Europe echoed this fixation, from English poet William Langland's visions of a society warped by greed and death to the apocalyptic sermons of Jean de Venette in France. Economic and social tensions, already sharpened by the labor shortages of the 1350s, boiled into open revolt. In France, decades of war with England combined with plague-era hardship to ignite the Jacquerie in May 1358. Peasants of the Oise and Beauvais regions rose against local nobles, furious over heavy taxation and the perception that the aristocracy had failed to protect them during the crisis. Armed with farm tools and sheer desperation, they attacked manor houses and castles, burning records of feudal dues. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart recount the ferocity of the uprising and the swift, brutal suppression that followed as mounted knights slaughtered thousands. Though crushed within weeks, the Jacquerie exposed the fragile foundations of a society where peasants recognized their newfound bargaining power and the vulnerability of those who claimed hereditary rule. England's reckoning came a generation later, but its roots lay firmly in the demographic shock of the Black Death. The Statute of Laborers of 1351 attempted to cap wages and tie workers to their home villages, but enforcement was nearly impossible when fields lay empty and labor was scarce. By 1381, resentment erupted in the Peasants' Revolt. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the preacher John Ball, thousands of men and women marched from Kent and Essex toward London, demanding the end of serfdom, a flat tax, and greater rights for commoners. They seized the Tower of London and executed royal officials before the revolt collapsed in violence. Though King Richard II reasserted control, the uprising accelerated the decline of villeinage, reshaping England's social contract. Religious dissent followed the same pattern of fracture and reformation. The failure of clerical intercession during the plague years encouraged movements that questioned church authority. The groundwork for later reformers, such as Jan Hus in Bohemia and, much later, Martin Luther, lay partly in the disillusionment that took root when prayers could not halt the Black Death. Lay confraternities, mystic sects, and localized devotional practices spread, emphasizing personal relationship with God over institutional mediation. Throughout Europe, the memory of sudden death remained vivid. Parish registers, tax rolls, and court documents bear silent testimony to vanished families and villages. Survivors carried forward an acute awareness of life's fragility and a sharpened sense of social possibility. Painters dwelled on skulls and timepieces. Composers wove somber motifs into liturgical music. Architects rebuilt churches and civic halls not just as acts of recovery, but as declarations that society could endure even when mortality had seemed absolute. The plague's first assault ended within a few years, but its psychological aftershocks stretched across generations. Fear of recurrence remained constant as new outbreaks flared intermittently through the 15th century. Each resurgence rekindled the memories of mass graves and empty streets, reinforcing both piety and skepticism. In this atmosphere, art, religion, and politics fused into a culture marked by unease, yet pulsing with new vitality. The Black Death had broken the old certainties, and in that fracture, Europe remade its faith, its art, and its capacity for resistance, carrying the scars as permanent reminders of an age when death had seemed to rule the world. The first great wave of plague receded by the early 1350s, but the demographic void it left behind shaped Europe for centuries. Population estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Europeans perished, reducing the continent from roughly 80 million people to near 50 million in only a few years. Recovery was slow. In many regions, census and tax records show that even by 1450, almost 100 years later, numbers had not returned to their pre-1347 levels. Entire villages remained empty, their fields absorbed by neighboring estates or reclaimed by forest. Urban centers grew unevenly. Some, like Florence, rebuilt quickly thanks to trade and banking wealth. Others, such as many small market towns in France and Germany, never regained their former scale. The scarcity of labor reconfigured the economy with unprecedented force. Agricultural lords, desperate to work their land, faced tenants who now held bargaining power. Across England, manorial rolls from the late 1300s record fixed rents replacing forced labor, a fundamental breach in the feudal system. Similar patterns spread across the Low Countries and northern Italy. Wages rose sharply. In England, day laborers could demand double their pre-plague pay within a generation, and despite legislative attempts such as the Statute of Laborers of 1351, the market prevailed. In France, surviving peasants negotiated lower feudal dues and freer movement, compelling nobles to concede rights once thought unassailable. This scarcity drove technological change. Watermills and windmills multiplied as landowners sought mechanical power to replace lost human hands. Iron production in the Rhine and Danube valleys expanded as new smelting techniques, including the early blast furnace, gained investment. In textile centers like Flanders and Florence, merchants financed improved looms and fulling mills to maintain output with fewer workers. The need for efficiency encouraged experimentation in agriculture as well. The three-field system gave way in some regions to more flexible crop rotations, while larger flocks of sheep supported a rising wool trade that required less manpower than grain cultivation. Urban life adjusted to the new demographic reality. With property abundant and workers scarce, wages for skilled artisans rose, creating a broader middle stratum of craftsmen and merchants. Guilds in cities such as Nuremberg and Bruges tightened membership to preserve these gains, strengthening their political influence. Banking houses from Florence to Lubeck diversified their investments, financing maritime ventures that would eventually lead to the Atlantic economies of the 15th century. This period saw the quiet emergence of early capitalist practices, contracts for future delivery, joint investment in ships, and the spread of double-entry bookkeeping pioneered in Italian city-states. Yet the plague never truly vanished. It returned in cycles, reminding Europe that the calamity of the 1340s was not an isolated catastrophe. The second major outbreak struck England in 1361–62, called the Pestilence of Children, because it claimed many of those born after the first wave. France, the Low Countries, and Italy suffered simultaneous recurrences, with mortality rates lower than 1348, but still devastating. Epidemics followed every decade or two. Paris in 1374, Venice in 1382, London in 1400. In the 17th century, the disease erupted with lethal intensity again. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed an estimated 100,000, while Marseille lost half its population in the outbreak of 1720–22. These episodes reinforced a culture of vigilance. Municipal boards of health, first formalized in Venice in 1348, became permanent institutions across Italian states and later in France and the Habsburg lands. Quarantine measures, the isolation of ships, and health passports developed through these experiences and formed the basis of modern public health. The psychological landscape of Europe carried the imprint of these cycles. Churches redesigned cemeteries and ossuaries to accommodate mass burials, giving rise to architectural features such as charnel houses and the widespread depiction of the danse macabre. The ever-present threat of return-shaped literature, from Chaucer's late 14th century tales to the moral dramas of 15th century morality plays. In medicine, the challenge to Galenic theory grew stronger as physicians compared clinical observations across successive epidemics. Universities in Padua and Montpellier encouraged anatomical study, while city authorities experimented with sanitation policies, from street cleaning to waste removal, testing early epidemiological ideas even without understanding microbes. Population growth eventually resumed, but along altered lines. In many areas, women married later and bore fewer children, a social adaptation to scarce resources and high wages. Migrants moved to underpopulated regions seeking opportunity, stimulating urbanization in places like London, Amsterdam, and the merchant ports of the Baltic. By the early 16th century, Europe's population again approached its early 14th century levels. But settlement patterns, economic structures, and social expectations had shifted permanently. The long horizon of the Black Death's aftermath reached into every corner of European life. The weakening of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, and the demand for technological innovation set the stage for the commercial expansion of the 15th century and the eventual Industrial Revolution. Maritime powers on the Atlantic coast, Portugal, Spain, later England, and the Dutch Republic, rose within this transformed landscape, benefiting from labor markets and financial practices forged in the crucible of plague. Each subsequent epidemic reinforced the hard-won understanding that disease could alter history as decisively as armies or kings. Europe entered the early modern era marked by loss, but also by new resilience, shaped by a century in which the memory of sudden, overwhelming mortality remained an unshakable presence and a catalyst for enduring change.